a great pleasure to introduce to you today our keynote speaker, Dr. Carolyn Benson, who's an Associate Professor in International and Comparative Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She has been associated with the Center for Research on Bilingualism, and later she's been at the Center for University Teaching and Learning, and meanwhile has been expanding her research and consulting in languages and literacies in the Southeast Asia, Pacific, Latin America and Africa regions. That pretty much covers the globe, but I guess there may be areas that... her current work focuses on educational language policy and practice, gender and language, and multilingual curriculum development. A recent publication also includes a background paper commissioned by UNESCO for the 2016 Global Education Monitoring Report. Well, I could actually go on for a while, but I would invite you, Kat, to now.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I would like to... Whoa, loud. Is it okay? Stand back. Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas Rashid, and thank you all for having me. I'm very, very honored to be here, and also looking forward to this opportunity to learn more about the context that we're talking about in Pakistan, which is a relatively new region for me, even though I've been trying to keep up to date on what many of you have been doing in this area. So thanks again for the invitation, for having me, and I'll try to make some sense of what's happening in multilingual education in a few different parts of the world, with the hopes that that information can be useful to us in our discussions in the next 2 days. I think I have control over the slides, but I'm not sure where to point this. So we'll see. And I need to see where my screen is. Okay. Great. So I thought I would start today by giving you a quick description of the field of mother tongue-based or L1-based multilingual education as I see it. And we can certainly discuss if there are some areas missing from this. I thought I'd talk about multilingual context in general and talk about some of the terms that we're using nowadays, which may help our discussions in the next couple of days, and give some theoretical basis for what we're doing in policy and practice. Then I'll get to some positive trends. I like to focus on the positive because I think that's where we have our examples, right? That's where we have our ideas and our inspirations for what we can do in different places. And then I'll raise some issues that I think still need to be addressed, and I'm already hearing some echoes of that in the case of Pakistan. And then I'd like to bring some new, I don't know how new it is to you, but a new paradigm or a new way of thinking about multilingualism and what we can do in education to promote the bilingual or multilingual skills that learners bring with them to the classroom, instead of trying to kill it, instead of trying to stop all of those processes from happening. So this is my picture of what I think is it small print? We'll see if you can see it. My idea of what has to happen when we're talking about language issues in education. We're talking about educational development and improving the quality of instruction. We're talking about giving children access, not just access to schools, but access to learning, right, in a language that they understand. I believe that the field of comparative education has a lot to contribute to this area, because when we're comparing what happens in different parts of the world, we can learn from each other and we can share resources. We're also talking about effective teaching, right? Using children's own languages and cultures as well as their experiences, what they bring with them from their homes and their communities into the school and building on those, as Dr. Rashid was saying. We're also talking about more structural changes that have to happen in language policy and planning. What kinds of policies can be enacted that will be what Neville Alexander of South Africa used to call enabling policies. What kinds of policies can be passed that will enable good things to happen at the school level. But then we have the added challenge of actually making those things happen. And that comes with all of these other things, like developing the languages to the extent that they can be put into materials used for teaching and learning at all levels. And then just the field of bi- and multilingual education in general. How are we talking about the use of different languages, the how and the when that were already mentioned in our introduction. So that's the field as I see it, and I'd be happy to talk about this later with people who are contributing to that field in many different ways. So this is how I kind of envision how the language mismatch is happening in many parts of the world, right? We have an ex-colonial language or an official or dominant language as medium of instruction, and then we have the learners coming to the school with their own home and community languages. And the teachers come with those languages also, not always matching. And then what happens at the school level? What is really happening with learning? And how can we make that happen in a way that's more effective for learners? Then in many cases, we're also talking about regional languages or languages of wider communication, languages that can be called lingua francae. And we're also talking about even additional international languages, like I already heard mentioned Mandarin, the case of Mandarin. So we're talking about a very complex world with lots of languages, and use complex in the most positive way, because I think complex is often used in a negative way. And so I'm going to be very positive about this, what we can do about these languages and what we can do in the schools. I'll try to give you some examples from other multilingual countries that I know their cases a little better, and also some inspiration from a case of Europe in a European regional minority language. So Kimmo Kosonen and I have been talking about, I don't think this is very earth-shattering, but these are some terms that we're using to good effect. We're using the term dominant language for any language that's socially or politically or officially dominant in a society, and the term non-dominant language, sorry for the acronyms, NDL, as any other language, often the languages that learners bring with them to school. The advantage of using these terms is that we can avoid the reference to size, so we can avoid the term minority. I do appreciate the term minoritized, because I think that many languages are minoritized, right? We purposely, or some people have purposely put them in a situation of being a minority. But actually, in many cases, for non-dominant languages, we can be talking about a language that's the case of Afan Oromo, for example, in Eastern Africa. I think, I'm looking at John, 33 million speakers or something like that. But it's still a non-dominant language in Ethiopia. So to take away the size or population as a figure. Also because we're talking about the rights of the speakers of these languages to have their languages used in education. It doesn't matter if there's 2 people or 20 million. We also want to highlight the power difference, because we think that that's important, and that is a consideration when you're developing policy. By using dominant and non-dominant, we can also show that it's a very arbitrary distinction. For example, Khmer is the dominant language in Cambodia, but if you take 2 steps across the border in Vietnam, it's a non-dominant language. So, and I'm sure you can talk about some of your languages like that. And we want to make appropriate educational considerations or accommodations due to the power differences. So that's why we like these terms. I will mention a couple of difficulties with these terms, and I'd be happy to talk to you about this in discussions. One of the disadvantages is that it may make it seem like English will always be a dominant language and, I don't know, Khmer will always be a non-dominant language. But in fact, those things change. They change over history, and they change due to different political happenings, events. So we don't want it to seem like if you have a non-dominant language, it will always be non-dominant. And another difficulty with having these labels is that it may seem like a dichotomy. You're either dominant or you're non-dominant. But in fact, we know that there are dominant, non-dominant languages, right? There are some languages that are more dominant than others, but still not fully dominant. So anyway, you see the problem. So we're using these terms with the understanding that there's some difficulty with them also. And then we use the term mother tongue with the understanding that there are also challenges associated with calling something a mother tongue, especially in multilingual regions, right? And I say C1 here. Do you know what I mean by C1? Any guess? Learner comes to school with at least one L1 and also a C1.
Community language.
Community, okay. Actually, I didn't think of community, but it's almost the same. I was thinking of culture. Thank you, but I think community, yeah. So we're assuming that an L1, there's one of them, and in fact, often coming from the home, there may be more than one home language, right? So Tove Skutnov-Kangas has identified mother tongue as a language that one learns first, or a language that one identifies with, or a language that one knows best, or a language that one uses most. So you can see that this is a very all-encompassing view of mother tongue, and in fact, many of us could say that we have plural mother tongues. Kimo Kosonen and I have added another definition that we would like to include with the idea of mother tongue, and that is one or more languages that one speaks and understands well enough to learn age-appropriate content in school. So that's with the understanding that sometimes you won't be able to use the child's best language, but you can use a language that the child understands well enough and speaks well enough to learn content at the age or at the grade level that he or she is studying. So those are ideas, and we realize that it can be pluralized, which is, it makes the term a little bit problematic. We've been sticking with L1 just because it helps us understand that we're using a non-dominant language. We're suggesting that that language should be used in school. We could say that UNESCO among others has been talking about the language issues in education for a long time. One of the most famous quotes that probably everyone knows by heart by now, but I would throw it out there, is that we take it as axiomatic or normal that the best medium for teaching is the mother tongue of the pupil. So this was said a long time ago, and UNESCO has stood for this, I think, in a very important way for many years. But then we have the issue of policy, what happens in policy, and then what happens in practice. But as a principle, I think this has been a very important stance that UNESCO has taken, that many have followed. The work of Jim Cummins, an Irish scholar working in Canada on bilingual education programs in French-English originally. He's become a specialist, a world specialist in how to manage languages in school, and he says the L1 is foundational and there's no more question in his mind about that. So we'll send any arguments, we'll send to him. And then there have been arguments, for example, by Tove Skutnov-Kangas and others about how important it is to preserve the resources that come with people's languages. So their cultural and their values, their traditions, their identities, and also information. So one of the arguments that I think is really compelling here is the idea that people have specialized understanding of, for example, traditional medicine or plants and animals in their surroundings. This may be key to human survival. And if we allow languages to die, we're also allowing that information that the languages have coded to die with it. So I think that's a very compelling argument also, that perhaps would be useful. And then, of course, we have the power of dominant languages, particularly European languages, and that kind of goes back to development, seeing development as modernization, seeing education as sort of the Western concept of education. I believe, Western notion, probably you could trace this back to France, the idea that one nation should have one language, which is ridiculous. And the idea also that dominant languages, particularly outsider languages, are somehow neutral, which I think is a very big mistake to make. And I think that mistake has been made in post-apartheid South Africa, where English was seen as somehow politically neutral language. And it's now systematically keeping children from learning something. And I think you see these kinds of attitudes in the reporting. Here's where I go back to UNESCO and say, what are you doing? Because whenever you read about statistics related to literacy or illiteracy, you almost never read in what language or how is literacy assessed. And I think there's some really large inconsistencies in our discussion related to language, or the lack of mentioning of language as a major issue. And I would characterize a lot of these things that are on the right-hand side of this slide as having a language as problem orientation. So now we'd like to look at more positive views of language as a resource. I don't know if these theoretical understandings are familiar to you, but I think a lot of what we do in how we use languages in school relate to Jim Cummins' work about the L1 being the foundation, that we can, that learners can transfer the abilities that they learn, for example, literacy, learning to read and write, that you only have to learn to read and write once, and that you can transfer that information to your additional languages. Even when the writing system is different, you still understand that coded language, the language that you speak, can be written and read. So we know that transfer is multi-directional. For example, you could learn to read in a foreign language and transfer that information back to languages in which you're familiar. However, that's a very inefficient way to learn. And then we also know that learners who transfer their skills across languages, they also develop a kind of meta-linguistic awareness. That is, an awareness of how languages function, how they may be different, how the main idea may come at the beginning of what you say, or in the middle, or at the end. You learn all those things when you speak more than one language. And we could argue that these are very valuable skills in a modern are we in the 21st century now? Yeah, 21st century world. And here's Cummins' iceberg model, which I find very funny because usually I'm working in very hot countries where people don't see icebergs in their backyards. But the whole idea of the iceberg being that there are peaks that come outside the ocean that you can see, and they look like different languages. But when you actually go under the water, what you see is that there's one main body of ice, and that's what Cummins calls the common underlying proficiency. That's our basic language skills that we all have in our brains, and they can be exhibited in different languages, but it's one main set of competencies. So this comes back, I think Mr. Rashid already said this morning, that in a similar way, right? That the stronger your skills in your strong language, your L1, the stronger your skills will be in additional languages, provided that you're actually taught those additional languages well by someone who is proficient. So that has implications for teachers, our teachers, right? Can pass any policy we want, but if teachers do not have the proficiency that they need, it's not going to happen. New languages don't come out of the air. So I think that a lot of the ways that we talk about languages are still can be represented by this language as problem orientation or having a monolingual habitus. So habitus comes from Pierre Bourdieu's work, and it just means it's a bit like your habits or your assumptions, things that you believe are true that you never question. An example of this might be if your friend says, if you say, I went to the doctor today, and your friend says, what did he say? There's an assumption there that the doctor is a he, right? That's a habitus that we've all been struggling against, and we need to do the same thing with languages. So what we're hearing often is people who believe that there's just one language that's important. And I think we're trying to get away from that now. But Ingrid Gogolin's work has been to show that many people have this idea that multilingualism is not important and that we need to take away one language to gain another. Ofelia Garcia calls this having a monoglossic ideology. Bunch of terms for the same thing, the idea that only one language is important. So that idea that only one language is important, it has come through in many ways when we're talking about education, because the question is often what happens when learners don't speak the language of the school. So where are we putting the fault? We're putting it on the learners. Sorry, but it's not their fault, right? So the question should actually be, what happens when the school doesn't speak the language of the learners? And that's when we see problems. And that's when we see all of these issues that come up with repetition, high dropout. Children are not stupid. And that's when you see the results of standardized tests or even just results from schools, it makes all children look really not able. And we know that all children are able. So the question should be asked in the second way. Why are we not changing, adapting the school for the needs of the learners? So when we're talking about equity, I think this is where we're really depending right now on Sustainable Development Goal 4.5, which to me is very sad because it's 1% of one goal 4 and almost no language-related references in this goal. I don't know what happened to language in the Sustainable Development Goals, but I find it inexcusable. At least we have these terms, we're looking at vulnerable people, but I think we should be looking at everyone. We should be saying, what about the languages and cultures that people bring with them to learning? And when we're talking about equity, I believe that we're talking about whether or not the languages of instruction allow the learner to access initial learning and also continuing learning and literacy, as well as other subjects of the curriculum. So equity means not giving the same education, equal education to everyone. It means giving an appropriate education to people in a context-specific way, right? In this context, the type of education that's needed is X, so that children can succeed. And maybe in a different situation, the type of education is Y. So that's what equity means, I believe. We can talk about equity in other situations. So the question that I think is important is, what would a multilingual habitus look like? If we're going to change everyone's thinking about languages, how do we do it? So we're trying to take a language as resource orientation to our work. In two countries that I can mention today. They have gone from experimenting or piloting a multilingual education program to actually changing policy. So I thought I would mention them. In Mozambique, there was a very successful experiment for 5 or 6 years in 2 different regions with 2 different languages. And then they actually were able to go on through the work of some university linguists, made sure that the languages of Mozambique were using, they have an orthography that works for all of those languages. And so they've helped a lot from the university level and also from the Ministry of Education research level to expand what can be done in L1-based instruction. And so they're working in more than 20 languages now, and it's as an option. So in the policy since 2002, there are options. The school system can continue monolingually in Portuguese, the dominant language of that country, an official language of that country, or communities can opt for an L1-based approach where children learn in both languages, both mother tongue and Portuguese. In Cambodia, they have, you may have been hearing about Cambodia because it's a really interesting case right now. They started it in 2002, the ministry working with CARE International, working in I believe they started with 2 languages, 2 indigenous languages in the northeastern part of Cambodia, and teaching Khmer, the dominant language, as an additional language. And they've been able to, by working hand in hand with the ministry, they've been able to take these schools that were community schools, using community members, not officially certified teachers, and actually it's become part of national policy to have a L1-based multilingual education program. And those teachers have been given a route to becoming official qualified teachers. And then at the same time, the ministry has located teachers who are qualified, who speak some of the other languages, and they've been able to expand multilingual education in those languages. So they're up to 5 languages. They're adding 2 more. Those 2, I have to say, the downside is that each language has to be officially approved by the Ministry of Education. And so 2 of those languages are still in the process, and they've been in that process for many years. So I'm not sure if that process is really working. So that's an area where maybe university linguists can start to be more helpful and recognize languages to be used in school. We have a couple of countries where there are pilot level projects to use local languages in school with dominant languages taught as additional languages. And I think the explicit teaching of additional languages is very important. There was a reference to that as well. Dr. Rashid mentioned that sometimes Urdu isn't really taught, it's just used as a language of instruction. So we have that same issue with the dominant languages in these contexts. They need to be taught explicitly. I thought I'd share with you, this is also a pilot level program, but they seem to be doing a really good job. It's in the Terai part of Nepal, and using Rajbanshi, which is a cross-border language with India. Rajbanshi L1, Nepali L2, English L3, and they've been able to stick to the Nepali national curriculum as much as possible, but work in the 3 languages. I still believe that they're in too much of a hurry to introduce L2 and L3, but at least L1 stays in the primary system throughout the years, up through the end of primary. And they're having some very good results from this. So this is a project to watch. Ethiopia and Eritrea are 2 very low-income countries, high levels of multilingualism, and amazing policies for 8 years of mother tongue-based education, with the addition of Amharic L2 and English L3. So they've been doing, I was involved in a study and I think there's some new studies coming too in Ethiopia to show how much can be done if you actually allow children to use their home languages for up to 8 years of primary education. One of the things that we found, I'm referring to number 2 here, is that in some areas they didn't have enough teachers to manage L1, so they switched to English earlier, and it doesn't necessarily improve learners' English. So that goes back to that idea of common underlying proficiency, right? The better you do at developing L1, the better results you have in additional languages. And Ethiopia also gives us a couple of warnings. One is that if you teach multilingually, but you only test in the dominant language, it's going to have a very negative backwash effect. In other words, teachers are going to think, oh, the exams are in L3. We have to prepare children as soon as possible for those exams. If, however, you actually tested in 2 or more languages, what you would find out is that you would learn what children are learning, you would be able to assess their learning effectively, and you would take away that pressure, that rush, that fever to get to the dominant language as soon as possible. So I think that's one of the areas that we really have to focus on. How am I doing on time? Pretty, okay.
Yeah, 15 minutes.
15 minutes,
Yeah.
Thank you. So what have we learned? I think we've learned a lot of things, and I hope that we'll hear more of those lessons learned from all of our speakers at this conference. But I think we know, and Jim Cummins is convinced that we know this. If you maximize the development of L1 skills, it will only have good results for learners. So there's not much question on the part of specialists. And Jeet Mohanty, who many of you may know, he's at JNU in Delhi. He has also quite a bit of evidence for this. We also know, I like to bring this in because I think it's very important, that language has very positive gender effects. There are a lot of hypotheses for why this is, and we know that using children's own languages and cultures in school, it's good for everybody, boys and girls, female and male teachers. It's good for everybody. But we think it's even better for girls. One hypothesis is that if girls are in a culture where teachers believe that they are inherently less able than boys, when you use their language, they show what they know, and teachers are faced with evidence to the contrary, right? Evidence that girls are quite capable, just as capable as boys. So that's one bit of evidence that we have. There also have been a couple of very interesting studies of how multilingual education is actually cost effective. So for all of you economists out there, World Bank scholars looked at 2 programs, one in Senegal and one in Guatemala. And what they found is that if you're going from a system that is basically monolingual and you're making it multilingual, the main inputs to education, inputs in terms of money and resources, are teacher education and materials development. Those are the big costs. If you think about a system that is monolingual, that does not serve children well, the big costs there are repetition and dropout. So if you look at per pupil expenditure, it's actually quite high per pupil, because you have to keep children in the system for a long time and they're still not succeeding. So in many poor countries, per pupil expenditure, PPE, is very high because of this repetition and dropout. So if you balance per pupil expenditure with the change that happens when children can actually understand what they're learning, they don't repeat as much, they don't drop out, they don't fail. And so your per pupil expenditure goes down. And in the 2 cases of Senegal and Guatemala, they found that there was a break-even point after only 2 years. So that is, the costs of teacher education and materials development were balanced out by the benefit in per pupil expenditure after only 2 years. So whenever someone says to you that multilingual education is expensive, I would be happy to refer you to those studies. There's also a European, a Swiss professor named François Grand. He may be the only economist of language, and he has also done some work in this area. I just wanted to share with you, I'm near the end, I wanted to just share with you, I showed this picture at the beginning of my presentation, but this is a speaker, a little boy speaker of Shishangana. He's in second grade, I believe, and when it was just so nice to visit his classroom and see that he and his peers could read and write their own ideas, which is unheard of in Mozambique. Usually they are repeating something that they don't understand, and they might even be repeating it backwards because it has absolutely no meaning to them. That's what their classrooms look like. And to see what had happened was their school had just gone to L1 based literacy learning. Their teacher, who was not a trained teacher, had come in on a Monday morning. He had asked them what they did over the weekend. They had each discussed it. The teacher had modeled his example of what he had done over the weekend. He had written it on the board in their own language. And then each child wrote in his or her book the experiences that they had had over the weekend. And we went around, I went with my colleague who translated, and each child read his or her experiences back to us. And as you can imagine, I was very emotional, but the emotional in a good way, crying and smiling at the same time, because these children were actually expressing their own ideas. And that is the seed of learning, right? That is going back to what was said at the beginning about critical thinking, and how do you engage in your own learning processes. This is what we want from education, I believe. We don't want children to sit there repeating things that they don't understand, even if they can repeat them on a test in a language they don't understand. So I'm getting to, maybe I should skip this. I'll do this one really quickly, and if anyone's interested, we can talk about it later. This is not earth-shattering, but my colleague Kimo Kosen and I have been working on this. How does policy change happen? So we know that some change comes from above, from official structures. We know that some change can come from below, from communities. But we also think that there are important side actors. And probably many of us in this room are what we would consider side actors. So side actors are donors, NGOs, I think education, faculty, linguists, people who are trying to actually make policy work in classrooms. And then we also find that there are roles for key agents, certain people who are very charismatic or who are able to talk to people about how multilingual education works. So I just thought I'd throw that in there because I think that the change from the side, or I think we have to see change from all of these different angles, but they kind of have to happen around the same time. So that's just a little bit of theorizing on the policy. Remaining issues, what we find, or what I can complain about, is that even where people are taking a more multilingual habitus, they're only giving a little bit of space to the L1. So often the L1 is only being used in grades 1 and 2, and then there's a rush to a dominant language. So we know that that doesn't give learners enough time. It's not a matter of being smart. It's a matter of human language development. It takes time, and literacy development as well. So 2 years is not enough, and you're not going to see big changes. I really want to focus on the word transfer here, because a lot of people talk about transition, right, or bridging. They want to get to that dominant language as soon as possible. That's not the way learning works, and language learning works. So we need to teach for effective transfer. Children will actually start transferring their literacy skills automatically when they are ready. So if teachers are complaining that they're not transitioning to the dominant language, that means it's because they're not ready. Another issue is the failure to consider, assess, or recognize teachers' linguistic resources. We're not giving teachers credit for the languages and proficiencies that they bring to the classroom, and then we're asking them to do impossible things with languages that they don't speak. I'll leave it at that. Assessment only in a dominant language, we already talked about that. And then there's this myth of maximum exposure. The idea that you have to rush to the dominant language as soon as possible, when we know that that doesn't necessarily have a good result. I don't know if it helps to talk to policymakers like this, but I think there's a conflation of what's an official language and then what's a medium of instruction. They don't have to be the same. And you might take different approaches in different parts of the country to reach your goals. So last point, what would a multilingual habitus look like if you take a language as resource or orientation, but you also use learners' languages as foundations for learning additional languages? That is, we start thinking multilingually. In multilingual cultures, it shouldn't be that hard. And I'd like to start a trend of talking about eradicating monolingualism. Tove Skutnap-Kangas used to say, monolingualism is curable. It's an illness, and you can cure it, like malaria. So let's eradicate monolingualism and focus on multilingualism as cognitively desirable. So there's some Europeans, Ulrike Jessner is one of them, working on what happens in your brain when you are multilingual and multiliterate. That language plus language plus language is actually not just 3 languages. It's a new condition that, in fact, in your brain, it's even different than just 2 languages. So there's some very exciting research happening on multilingualism as the psycholinguists are working on that. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of inspiration. I don't know how we're going to apply these ideas in low-income situations, but I think if we focus on teachers' linguistic resources, we might be able to do this. The integrated plurilingual curriculum, as practiced in the Basque country in Spain, uses Basque, non-dominant language, community language, also Spanish, also French, and also English. So each of the languages is approached in a slightly different way, but they're focusing on how skills transfer across languages. So the curriculum systematically teaches all of these languages and teaches through these languages by promoting L1, or the non-dominant language, as the sort of basis for that. And they identify common competencies among the languages, and they explicitly teach the differences. So this is going to be really small print, but I will share this PowerPoint later. What we're trying to show is for 3 of the languages that you can see, maybe you can see the colors at least. So the blue represents, or dark blue, represents common features. So skills that would transfer across the 3 languages. Green represents skills that are actually graded in the curriculum, and red represents features of the language that are specific to that language. So I can show you more about this curriculum later, but I think it's really a good start at thinking multilingually and maximizing learners' multilingual resources. And I think this is the way our field is headed, but I'm not sure. But if I have any choice, this is the way we'll be going, to maximizing multilingualism and improving children's ability to read and write in multiple languages, because I think those are skills that will help them in the 21st century. So that's it. I have a lot of really tiny references there, but I'll share the whole presentation with you. So I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you very much.